Okay, let's begin and start off by talking about the skeletal system. One of the things that I really want to hammer home with folks is that your bones, your skeleton, okay, your femur bone, it's the largest, strongest bone in your body. And it's an organ, much like your liver is an organ, much like your brain is an organ. So when we're talking about the skeleton, I want you to get in the habit of thinking, all right, that your bones are an organ, okay? So when we talk about the different components here to the skeletal system, all right, obviously we're going to talk about the bones. We'll be spending most of the time in this chapter discussing bones. But we'll also discuss some of the other components of the connective tissue. Remember that bone is supporting connective tissue, as is cartilage, okay? And then, of course, we need something to hold the bones together, so we have some soft tissue that we'll throw in there, all right, specifically a dense regular connective tissue, the ligaments. All right, and of course, we have some other structures, some other connective tissue like tendons. We'll discuss those briefly, but we'll talk more about those when we get into the muscle chapter, okay? All right. So like I said before, in this chapter, our bones are the primary organs that we're going to be discussing. All right, and we're going to get into in a few slides here what the functions of our bones are. All right, but the skeletal bones primarily provide our rigid framework. If we didn't have that, we'd just be a blob. I mean, really. Okay, so when someone calls you spineless, that would be true. You don't have a spine, you have nothing. Okay, but ideally, all right, our bones, and again, depending on whether you've studied adaptation and evolution and all that, you can see how our skeletal system has changed and adapted throughout. Well, perfect example, I went on a tour of Boone Hall Plantation. It's down in Charleston on Mount Pleasant. And we were walking around this house, and I don't know how old the house was. It was less than 200 years old. But in just that period of time, from the time when they built the house to present day, I noticed that the doorknobs were a lot closer to the ground. And the reason why is traditionally people in that time were shorter. So just in the 100+ years that we've been around, in general, on average, humans have adapted and gotten taller on average. So that's just one of the adaptations that we see. So talking about the skeletal system, we're beginning with the bone, and we've already seen this already, so this should be a little bit of review for you, all right? We got two types of bone, compact and spongy, all right? Now, you do want to know the secondary names for these bones, for this type of bone, all right? You have dense and cortical, all right? And obviously, the compact bone, the dense bone, is going to make up the majority of the bone mass and weight. So in this case, it's 80% for the compact bone. The other 20% comes from spongy bone. We call it cancellous or trabecular, okay? And it looks like a sponge. So there's little nooks and crannies and holes in there, okay? So we'll also describe it as being porous. But you have the compact bone. If this is a long bone, this is a horrible drawing of my long bone, but whatever, okay? All right, so the outer blue line there, that's the compact bone. And then on the inside, internal to that, all right, you'll have your spongy bone, your trabecular bone. Okay, so the spongy bone, all right, is going to be internal to the compact bone. And that kind of setup that we have, that architecture that our bone has, believe it or not, adds strength and support and integrity to the bone. The fact that the spongy bone is on the inside, all right, it does offer some rigidity to your bone. Okay. The other type of connective tissue in this chapter is going to be cartilage. Obviously, cartilage is more flexible. A lot of that has to do with cartilage has a relatively high water concentration, okay, that adds to its flexibility. Also, the collagen fibers, okay, also will add to that flexibility. So cartilage is going to be more flexible than bone, but it's still going to be somewhat rigid. All right, and there's two types that we're really going to get into in this chapter. You know, there's three types of cartilage. We have the fibrocartilage, the hyaline cartilage, and the elastic cartilage. But the elastic cartilage doesn't really play a role in the skeletal system, so we're not really going to discuss it. Hyaline cartilage, that's the most common type of cartilage, all right, in the body, okay? And so we'll see this, and in fact, we saw it on Tuesday. All right, all the costal cartilage, that's the cartilage that attaches the ribs to the sternum. All right, so we saw it there on the ribs. All right, we'll also see it, we give it another name when we're talking about the cartilage on the ends of the bones. We refer to that hyaline cartilage as articular cartilage. We'll get into that. Okay, so having that articular cartilage on the long bones helps to reduce friction. All right, it makes it slippery, much like ice does to the sidewalk in the wintertime. The hyaline cartilage will make the ends of the bones smoother, all right, so they can move by each other with much more ease. Okay, and then we'll also discuss the hyaline cartilage when we're talking about the growth plates. That'll probably be next week. Okay, and then finally, between weeks 8 and 12 of development, of fetal development, you have an outline of a skeleton. Okay, we call it the fetal skeleton, and it starts to turn into bone. Well, prior to that, all right, your fetal skeleton is primarily made up of hyaline cartilage, and we'll talk about how that process, that transition from cartilage to bone, is going to actually work. It's called ossification. The other type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. This is that cartilage that we see only in 3 places. You need to know all 3 of those places. Okay, you're going to have your intervertebral discs, all right, the pubic symphysis, and then the shock absorbers of the knee, the menisci there. Okay, but its main job is to withstand compression. Okay, this type of cartilage, all right, is very dense. It has a very high collagen content. All right, very little ground substance. Right, it has no perichondrium. You probably remember that from tissues. Right, no perichondrium, but it does. All right, but hyaline cartilage does have perichondrium. Okay, and then we'll briefly talk about ligaments, which is a dense, regular connective tissue, and tendons. Keep in mind, ligaments attach bone to bone. Okay, tendons attach muscle to bone. Don't get those confused, please. Okay, bone to bone is ligaments. Tendons to bone, muscles to bone are going to be tendons. So here you can see on our little picture here, all right, all the places where you see hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is here in blue. Okay, you can see it's here in our joints for the long bones. All right, we call it articular cartilage. You can even see it's down here in the fingers and our knuckles there. All right, costal cartilage, that's hyaline cartilage. Okay. And then now when we go and switch over and talk about the fibrocartilage is pretty much in the midline because that's where most of the compressive forces occur on your body. All right, the intervertebral discs here in the spine. Okay, the pubic symphysis, which is right here where the 2 hip bones meet each other in the front. All right, and then finally our menisci. All right, those shock absorbers in the knees here. Okay, so some of the functions for bone, and a lot of that you already know. Okay, what's one of the functions for bone? Off the top of your head. Structure, protection.
Storage.
Perfect, you remember. Yeah, storage. Stores calcium and phosphate. All right, some of our minerals there. Okay, so attachment sites, that's right. Attachment sites for lever action, because your muscles are going to move like a marionette almost, but the muscles will move the bones as levers for movement. Okay, so this is what we're going to see. Okay, when we're talking about some of the functions here: support and protection. Okay, levers for movement, storage we already mentioned. Okay, calcium is going to be important for actual integrity of the bone. Where calcium is needed, and we'll talk more in detail on proper nervous function, on proper function for muscles to contract. Okay, clotting. Calcium is needed for a lot of things. All right, phosphate, we know for ATP, for our energy reserves. Hemopoiesis is a very important, you'll get into this in much more detail in 211, but hemopoiesis is the actual process of our bones making blood cells. Okay? And our blood cells are the erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells, our leukocytes, which are our white blood cells, and then our platelets. Okay? So that when you see blood cell production, we're not just talking about the red blood cells, we're talking about all of them. Okay? And so this is going to occur on the internal portion of our bones, all right, specifically in our red bone marrow. Okay? Red bone marrow is a type of connective tissue. We'll talk about that. We're going to get into more detail. Okay? All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to discuss the different types or the different classifications of bones. All right, we have long bones, short bones. All right, we have got our irregular bones and flat bones. Okay, so a lot of the time in this chapter, I'm going to be using long bones as an example. All right, but you need to know all 4 classification types. Okay. So obviously our long bones, the length of that bone is going to be longer than it is wide. Okay, so the femur and the humerus, all right, those are the long bones in your leg and in your arm. So it's going to kind of look like this. Okay. Then a short bone is almost going to look, I don't want to say a square, but it's going to be like a cuboidal cell. Remember the dimensions of a cuboidal cell? It was as wide as it is tall. Well, for the short bones, same thing. The length and the width are going to be almost equal. And we'll see that in your carpal bones, and those are the bones that are found in your wrist, all right, and your tarsal bones, and those are going to be the bones that are found down in your feet, okay? Flat bones we've already seen, okay? We saw it when we were labeling the bones of the skull, all right? So these bones are relatively flat. They'll have some curvature to them, okay? But we see that up in some of the facial bones and the cranial bones. And then we have, of course, everything else. We just lump into this last category, which are the irregular bones. They're just shaped oddly. I won't say oddly, but just differently. Okay, very complex. All right. Your book describes it as elaborate. Okay, but perfect example is the vertebrae. Okay, C1 and C2. Those are very, very unique-looking bones. Okay. So we'll have a bunch of these other bones that we just lump into this category as irregular bones. Okay, like your mandible. All right, it's a very uniquely shaped bone. So those are the 4 classes: long, short, flat, and irregular. Okay, so when we look here at some of the examples here, you can see, okay, here's an example of our flat bone. Here's an irregular bone, the vertebrae, our long bone, and then you can see some of the tarsal bones down in here, all right, for our short bones. I wish they would show you the carpal bones because those are a little bit easier to tell. Okay. So what we're going to do now, am I going too fast? I can slow down. If I'm not going fast enough, I can speed up, okay? But I want to kind of get the basics out of the way here because we're going to get into some of the really interesting stuff here soon. Okay? I find all this stuff interesting, but it's going to get really interesting here soon. All right, so now we're going to take one of those classes and we're going to just focus on the anatomy of the one class, all right? And that's going to be the long bone because that's the one we're going to talk about quite a bit, okay? So let's talk about the anatomy of a long bone, okay? So when we talk about a long bone, and you guys have probably heard it before, we talk about a shaft of the bone. Up to this point, we'll call it a shaft, but now we're going to start calling it by its real name, and that's the diaphysis. So I'm going to draw my picture here of a long bone. Okay, so here's the diaphysis. That's the shaft of the bone. Okay. So this is going to be, the shaft of the bone is actually, and if we're talking about a bone in the lower extremity, that's going to be the weight-bearing portion of that bone. Okay, the shaft bears most of the weight. Also, you'll see quite a few muscular attachments and even the ligamentous attachments onto the shaft too. So it helps to create that lever action movement there. Okay, much like the strings do on a marionette, so to speak. Okay. So the blue line here again is going to represent the compact bone. On the inside, all right, we'll have our spongy bone. Very similar, okay? So when we're talking about long bones, this is very important. Long bones will have a hollow space in the middle. Okay, so we'll have this hollow space. And I need to be a little bit more specific about that. It's a hollow space in mature bone, okay? So in that space there, okay, we will find in kids, in children, red bone marrow. In adults, all right, because at the time when you're a kid or a child, all your bones are helping to make the blood cells, okay? All the bones are doing it. As we get older and we grow and we get bigger, we don't need all the bones to be making the blood cells anymore. Only certain bones, we'll talk about that in a moment, only certain bones will make your blood cells, okay? But some of your long bones kind of take a break. And when that happens, that red bone marrow becomes inactive, and it transitions into what we call yellow bone marrow because it resembles a fatty-like tissue. Okay, remember adipose tissue is kind of yellow, all right? So this the yellow bone marrow kind of takes on a yellowish appearance, all right, and it resembles a fatty type of tissue. Okay, so in adults, all right, that in some of our long bones, that red bone marrow becomes inactive. Okay, so going on to the next slide here, and I'm hoping I'm going to draw a better picture for you. Okay, we have the next structure, which is called the epiphysis. All right, and the epiphysis is the end of the bone. Okay, so here's the epiphysis. All right, and also down here is the epiphysis. Okay, but here's the thing. One epiphysis is going to be closer to the trunk. So obviously we refer to that as the proximal epiphysis. The one that's furthest away is going to be the distal epiphysis. Epiphysis, I can't talk today, sorry. All right, so we're talking about the humerus. That's the bone in your arm. And the arm is the portion between your shoulder and your elbow. Okay, so the part that makes up your shoulder joint, okay, that's going to be called the head of the humerus. That's the proximal epiphysis. Okay, and the part that's down by your elbow, that's the distal epiphysis. Okay, same type of scenario here, all right, with the epiphysis. Where that blue line is, that represents the compact bone, and then as I'm drawing here on the inside, all right, that's the spongy bone. Okay, throughout here. Now you don't have a medullary cavity, all right, in the epiphysis. Okay, that's only in the diaphysis. Okay, keep that in mind. So the outer layer is going to be compact. That's the blue line. The inner layer, that's going to be the spongy bone. That's the red. Good so far? Okay, cool. All right, so on our ends of the epiphysis there, we're going to have, all right, a layer, all right, of hyaline cartilage. Remember that articular cartilage that I was telling you about? Okay, so that is going to be found on the epiphysis. Okay, and instead of calling it hyaline cartilage, we refer to it as articular cartilage. Okay, you need to know that articular cartilage is just another name for hyaline cartilage. It's going to be found wherever that bone articulates with another bone. Okay, so that will be considered the joint surface. Okay, cartilage greatly reduces friction in that joint because, again, as bones move by each other, all right, if it was bone on bone, that'd be one, very painful, and two, could cause damage and create friction and cause degeneration. That's bad because that brings on the big A, arthritis. You don't want that. But also the hyaline cartilage acts as a shock absorber. Okay, it will absorb some of the shock that that joint actually is going to experience there. Okay. All right. So in our long bone here, okay, we talked about the diaphysis and we talked about the epiphysis, but we didn't talk about the area between the two. So this is the epiphysis, this is the diaphysis, but this area here where the bone kind of tapers down, here and here, okay, that's where we're going to find our growth plate, okay, and we give a name to that. That's the metaphysis, all right? So we can see this is the area, and be specific, in mature bone, all right, between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. In a immature bone, okay, in a younger bone, okay, the metaphysis, that's where the growth plate will be found. Okay, and remember when we were talking about the hyaline cartilage in our skeletal system, all right, one of the locations I told you was going to be found was going to be in the growth plate. We'll get into, you know, how this all operates. But again, it's a small area, all right, made up of hyaline cartilage. So essentially what happens, in the short of it, this layer of hyaline cartilage, all these chondrocytes create more chondrocytes and create cartilage. But as it's creating cartilage, eventually that cartilage will get pushed out, all right, and it turns into bone. Okay, and that's how your bone grows. And we'll get into all that. But it's this growth plate that is responsible for what we call the lengthwise bone growth. Meaning, here's our bone, okay, and then how the bone grows out in either direction, here and here. Okay, essentially how bone gets longer. Okay. And then, once you're all done with puberty and you're all done with growing and all those hormones that affect that growth plate stop affecting the growth plate, eventually that growth plate will end up ceasing to exist. All right, so no more cartilage will be found there. When that happens, all right, and it fuses together, it leaves this thin line in some long bones. In some long bones, it's easier to see than others. It'll leave a thin line there. And we refer to that as the epiphyseal line. And that is where the growth plate or the epiphyseal growth plate once existed. Okay? So now you could be done with these amateur drawings, and I can actually show you a really good diagram here. Okay? All right. So here you can see, we'll start with what we labeled first. Here's the shaft of the bone, otherwise known as the diaphysis. Okay, and if we were to zoom in really, really close, and it goes for the epiphysis too, on the outer portion here, you can see that's compact bone. Okay, compact bone. And then internal to that is going to be your spongy or trabecular bone. Okay, you can see it a little bit here on the diaphysis. Okay. In the diaphysis, we also see, okay, our medullary cavity here. Okay, now this medullary cavity is full of blood vessels, but also there would be yellow bone marrow in there. Okay, and then on the epiphysis here, you can see, all right, compact bone, spongy bone, but also on the exterior portion here, we can see you have the articular cartilage. And that articular cartilage is that hyaline cartilage. There's no growth plate here, but you can see that epiphyseal line where the growth plate used to exist. And as you can see, just by looking at this picture, would you say that bone is highly vascularized? I mean, look at all those blood vessels. Yeah, you're darn right. Because remember, our circulatory system is like our transport system of our body. All right, it's like our infrastructure in the United States for roads and train and railways. It's how we transport things around the United States. Our circulatory system transports things throughout our bodies. And so the site that makes your blood cells, all right, are your bones. So we got to get those blood cells out of the bone. And we have to get stuff into the bone too, you know? Or if we need like calcium, sometimes we need to resorb some bone and free the calcium, we got to get it out. So we have all these blood vessels to help with that. Now, if you look here on the outside of our bone, all right, there's a thin covering. And we're going to talk about that here on the next slide. That's called the periosteum. Remember, we talked about that briefly in the tissue chapter, okay, that the outside of the bone is covered by this periosteum, okay, and it allows for things to attach onto the bone, and it is actually a pain-sensitive structure. So let's talk about the periosteum right now, okay? So the periosteum is this tough protective sheet that goes around the external surface of the bone. And it's made up of two layers, okay? The outer fibrous layer and the inner cellular layer. Well, you need to know this. The outer fibrous layer, I've seen this asked on test questions, it's made up of a dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, dense, irregular connective tissue. Well, that's good because dense, irregular connective tissue can handle multi-directional stresses put upon it. So if we have ligaments and tendons pulling on it in all different directions, what better connective tissue to have than the dense, irregular connective tissue? Also, we'll get some blood vessels and some nerves, all right, that will also attach and run along the periosteum there. All right. And it also, because that dense irregular connective tissue is a dense connective tissue, all right, one of its functions is protection. So it helps to protect the underlying bone. Okay, so that's the outer layer. The inner layer, okay, We call it the intercellular layer because it has 3 cell types. You need to know these. We'll get it. I'll talk about their functions in a little bit. All right. But the 3 cell types are the osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts. When you see blast, think of B blast, B build. All right. These cells help to build the bone matrix, which we'll get into that. Then we have osteoclasts. And then we have to figure out a way how we are able to hold the periosteum onto the compact bone. No problem. All right, we're going to use some collagen fibers that are going to come off the periosteum, all right, and they're going to connect onto the compact bone. And we call those perforating fibers, or they're also called Sharpie's fibers. Okay? But they connect the periosteum onto the compact bone. So the periosteum is the name that we give that tissue that is found on the external or outside of the bone, okay? Because there's another covering that's going to be found on the inside. So let me show you a picture here. Okay, you can see here, here's the periosteum, we peeled it away. The outer layer, okay, this thicker pink layer here, that's the outer fibrous layer. That's all that dense irregular connective tissue, predominantly just bundles of collagen. Okay, and that's where all the stuff will attach onto. And then on the inside here, you can see we have this thin cellular layer, and that's going to be made up of the osteoprogenitor cells, okay, the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. And then we're able to stick this layer on to the compact bone here through these Sharpie fibers or these perforating fibers here. Okay, that's how we hold it together. Just use these collagen fibers. Questions so far? Okay, we're doing okay? Okay. Feel free to ask away. That's what I'm here for. All right. So here's the osteocyte cell. Remember that when we were talking about in tissues in lab? We talked about the lacuna, okay? And we have the osteocyte cell. Well, these are lacuna that these osteocyte cells are living in. But an osteocyte kind of looks like what you're seeing here. It's like this oval-like cell, and it's got these processes that shoot off of it. We'll get into the details there, okay? But that's the mature bone cell. And their job is to maintain this, the bone matrix. That's their job. So on the inside of a bone, okay, again, using the anatomy for a long bone here, this is going to be a transverse slice through our long bone diaphysis, okay? The blue is the outside of the bone, and then on the inside, okay, where I'm putting the X, that's the medullary cavity, okay? So then, lining that medullary cavity, we have some spongy bone. And what lines that spongy bone, all right, that is our endosteum. Okay? So it's going to cover everything that lines the medullary cavity, or all the internal surfaces of that medullary cavity, mainly the spongy bone, the trabecular bone. Okay? And it's made up of, you don't have to learn anything new, its cells are made up, its cell layer is made up of the same cell layer as you learned with the periosteum. So it's got osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. Okay? Except in this scenario, all right, it's not as, hold on one second. If you look here, okay, all these cells are pretty much uniform, all right, and they're lined up end to end to end. And this, whoops, and this one here, where am I going? Hold on one second. That's the one. In the endosteum, it's an incomplete cell layer, which means it's not going to be lined up end to end to end. All right, there'll be some gaps. All right, you'll have some cells in some areas, some cells in other areas. Okay, so we take a look here. Okay, this is part of the trabecular bone. Okay, well, where are you? Well, you can see you got here's an osteoclast, the big cell, and then you've got some osteoprogenitor cells and some osteoblasts kind of just scattered throughout. Okay, so that'll be the lining here of the medullary cavity. okay? And that's going to be your endosteum. All right, that's it for the anatomy of a long bone, okay? The other bones aren't as exciting, so I'll show you those real quick. I'll show you them because they're only on one slide. That's how non-exciting they are, okay? So, for short, flat, and irregular bones, okay, keep in mind, the similarity they have is the external surface is going to be the compact bone. The internal portion is going to be spongy bone. Same type of thing, okay? Except you need to know this and make a circle, whatever, star it. There's no medullary cavity, okay? Like I said before, the long bones are the only bones that have a medullary cavity. Short, flat, irregular bones do not, okay? That's one of the differences. But the similarity is, when we're talking about the external surface, that's still made of compact bone, just like in a long bone. When we talk about the internal surface, all right, or internal, not surface, but the internal portion of the bone is going to be made up of spongy bone, just like in our long bones. So when we talk about our flat bones, I'm going to show you a picture here. I want you to think of a sandwich. Whatever your favorite sandwich is. The example I used last night was a bologna sandwich, okay? And so your flat bone is going to be similar to that. So someone asked me last night, why do they call the spongy bone and flat bone diploid? And I don't know. Who knows? I just chalked it up to the Greeks when they were naming this stuff. They just wanted to give it a different name, okay? But when we're dealing with the flat bones of the skull, okay, you want to be aware of this, all right? When we're dealing with the flat bones of the skull, spongy bone, all right, is referred to as diploid, D-I-P-L-O-E with the two dots over that. I can't remember what those are. Okay, diploid. So we go to this slide here, and we can see it's like a sandwich. Okay, you can see you have the compact bone here and compact bone here, and then in between the two layers of compact bone is our diploid, the spongy bone. Okay, that's like the bologna. Okay, and then obviously you're going to have periosteum that lays on top of the compact bone. All right, even though where I'm moving this cursor, that is the external surface of the skull. All right, and this is the internal under here. Okay, you're still going to see periosteum on both sides. All right, on the outside and the inside. Think of it like a sandwich. Okay. All right. So like I mentioned earlier, when I was talking to you about the bones, all right, being an organ, they are a highly vascularized organ. You need to make note of that, okay? So like organs have nerves and blood supply coming to them, like the stomach does, like the liver does, like the pancreas. Your bones are no different, okay? They're going to have blood vessels and they're going to have nervous innervation, okay? But we got to figure out a way to get those nerves and blood vessels inside the bone. No problem. What we did is we drilled a hole in the middle of the bone. Usually it's in the middle of the diaphysis. Okay, so we drilled a hole. Of course, what do we call a hole in a bone? A rounded hole in a bone? Foramen. Okay, so in this case we call it the nutrient foramen. And so blood vessels can enter in and exit the nutrient foramen. Okay, as do nerves. Okay, so this is where you're going to see the nutrient foramen, where arteries and veins both enter and exit. And this nutrient foramen it pierces through the periosteum also. One thing you do want to know, that the main type of nerve or class of nerve that enters into the bone are going to be sensory nerves. We will learn later on the different types of nerves. Okay, there's motor nerves, there's sensory nerves. Okay, so the main type of nerve that is going to be affiliated or associated with the bone is going to be a sensory nerve. And these nerves are going to innervate the bone. What does that mean? Well, it's going to help to stimulate a bone to activate your osteoblasts, your osteoprogenitor cells, osteoclasts, all right? It's going to stimulate those bones, but also for pain reception, all right? If you get hit in the bone, all right, these nerves will sense that, okay? If it has to stimulate the cells in the inner cell layer of the periosteum or the cells in the endosteum, it will do that. If we need to stimulate, okay, our red bone marrow to make more more blood cells, we'll stimulate the bone marrow, okay? Speaking of bone marrow, let's talk about it, okay? Let's talk about the two types, all right? We have red bone marrow and we have blue bone marrow. Just kidding, we have yellow bone marrow, okay? So bone marrow, all right, you want to know the other name for the red bone marrow. This will help you in 211. It's called myeloid tissue. Because when you learn about how the different blood cells start to differentiate, okay, we call those myeloid cells, all right? And there's different names for that. So the two types are red and yellow, okay? And we find it, all right, inside the bone here. And for the red, this is the one that undergoes hemopoiesis, okay? Hemopoiesis. And that is the process of making our blood cells. So you're probably wondering, when the heck are we ever going to talk about reticular connective tissue? Well, here you go, all right? Reticular connective tissue is the connective tissue that we see mainly with lymphoid organs, you know, lymph nodes, the spleen. Well, we see it here, okay, in our bones, all right? And this is where, all right, our blood cells will be produced and where they can mature. So the red bone marrow is made up of the reticular connective tissue, obviously our immature blood cells, and then there's some fat involved. Always need fat. So in kids, all right, pretty much we will find red bone marrow inside the spongy bone and the medullary cavity of the long bones. Like I said, when you're a kid, all right, or child, you're going to be recruiting all the bones to help make, all right, your blood cells, okay? Then as you grow up into an adult, now we'll primarily see, all right, hemopoiesis, red bone marrow in the axial skeleton, okay? So if we look at the list here, the skull, check, that's part of the axial skeleton. The vertebrae, check, that's another part of the axial skeleton. Ribs, axial skeleton. Sternum, axial skeleton, okay? The exceptions, all right, are going to be your hip bones, os coxa, okay? And then the proximal epiphysis of the femur, which is that big leg bone that you have, and the humerus, okay? So I'll show you a picture. Whoops. There you go. Okay, so here you can see the axial skeleton is going to be the primary area now in adults that is going to be responsible for hemopoiesis. And then you can see the proximal epiphysis of the humerus and the proximal epiphysis of the femur. Okay, so we keep pretty much all our blood cell making, all right, in our upper half of our body, okay, close to the axial skeleton. So yellow bone marrow, okay, is that inactive bone marrow. It used to be red, and then as we got older, we didn't need it anymore, all right, and so it degenerated and became inactive. And so it's mainly made up of fat. But the yellow would be what you, wait, I missed that, hold on. Not to sound gross, but the yellow would be what you eat, right? Are you referring to when they serve bone marrow in restaurants? I think, like ossobuco. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I didn't. I've heard it and about it in the restaurants. You know what? To be honest with you, I am not quite sure for animal physiology how that works. I would assume possibly. Has anyone here ever had bone marrow before? No. No. Heather, have you had bone marrow before? It's a weird question. You have? Did you like it? It's delicious. Yeah. I'm not surprised. You worked in a restaurant. But yeah, I want to say I've tried it before, and I cannot remember my experience with it. I do think I liked it only because if I didn't like it, I would definitely remember. But again, yeah, I couldn't tell you if it's red or yellow. So most of the animals long bones their entire lifetime. Oh, all right. Well, thank you, Tara. Didn't know that. All right, interesting. One of the things that I think is really cool about the yellow bone marrow is if you're in an anemic situation, it will convert back into red bone marrow. And what an anemic situation means, your blood cell production is low, or your blood cell content is low. Okay, like people with iron deficiency anemia. Okay, the amount of red blood cells they have is not enough, or it's not enough for the oxygen carrying capacity demand placed on the body. So your body starts to make more red blood cells. Okay, and if the existing red bone marrow is not enough, then the areas that are yellow bone marrow will convert into red bone marrow, and then they'll start to make the blood cells. Okay, it's really quite fascinating. But then it'll actually return back into yellow once the demands are met. Okay, but it's really kind of neat. For example, folks that actually go and climb mountains, all right, they have to train, or it's called acclimatization. People that go climb like Mount Everest, okay, they have to spend a couple weeks at what they call base camp, which is I think 15,000 feet or 20,000 feet. They spend a couple weeks there, and then they go up to what they call Camp 1, and then they go up a couple more 1,000 feet, and they'll spend a couple days there, or a couple weeks there, because what happens is the oxygen demand on your body, all right, is a lot different there than it is here in this room for us. So your body needs to make more red blood cells to carry the oxygen. Yes, sir.
Also, like some like Olympic athletes do that they train in like high altitude areas.
Yep. They found that out when they had the Olympics there in Mexico City because of its altitude. And so it's almost like a natural form of blood doping. What they'll do is they'll train at a high altitude where there's not as much oxygen there, so their body demands that oxygen, so it'll make more red blood cells. Problem is, when you make more red blood cells, your blood becomes thicker, becomes more viscous. So you're more apt to have clotting issues, and when the blood becomes kind of like motor oil, you can have issues with that, and you can get a pulmonary embolism in some cases. So there's a risk involved. So it's seen. Yes, ma'am. That's a great question. No, it does not, because it takes several days to actually make the red blood cells. So just if you're up for a couple of hours, and I don't know what the longest constant flight is in the United States, or worldwide, I should say, 14 hours maybe, 16 hours might be the longest. So it won't be enough. You'll start to feel some effects, but it won't be to the point where you start to make more red blood cells. But that's a great question. Okay. Well, we already saw that slide. Okay, now we're going to get into some fun stuff here. Okay. We're going to start talking now, all right, about bone connective tissue and what's involved, what cells are involved. We're going to learn about a whole bunch of different processes here. All right. So fun equals hard. It could. I don't know. I'm going to try to make it as easy as possible. All right. We'll make it easy fun. Okay. So keep in mind when we're talking about connective tissue, all right, there's three parts to connective tissue: the cells of the connective tissue and the extracellular matrix. But in this case, remember, extracellular matrix is ground substance, GS, and protein fibers. Okay. And we already know all that, right? What makes up connective tissue? Cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. Okay. So bone is no different. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the cells. There's four types. osteoprogenitor cells, okay? Osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts, okay? I'll give you a second to write that down as I take a sip of water. All right, osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. All right. So let's go through each cell individually. Okay, the osteoprogenitor cells, these are the stem cells. So when you hear stem cells, the next tissue that you should be thinking of is this, mesenchyme. Remember mesenchyme? That's where all that connective tissue actually comes from. Connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue comes from embryonic connective tissue or mesenchyme. Okay? So this is the nice thing about these osteoprogenitor cells. Okay? They can actually, they're that mesenchymal tissue, all right, and they'll divide, and when they divide, one of the cells that yield from that division will become what we call a committed cell. Okay, so one will be a stem cell, which is nice, all right, but then we get a committed cell. Okay, and that committed cell, all right, when it matures, is going to become an osteoblast. And what did we say about osteoblast? B, build bone. All right. If you walk out of this classroom today with nothing else except for B builds bone, I'll be happy. All right. I hope you walk out with a lot more, but osteoblasts build bone. That's their job. Okay. And we saw where they were located. Remember, in the inner cell layer of the periosteum, and then also in the endosteum. Okay. So that means that they're going to build bone on the outside of the bone, and then they're going to build bone on the inside of the bone. Okay? Or on that inner medullary cavity there, because they're in the endosteum. Okay? So the osteoprogenitor cell divides. All right? One of those two cells is another osteoprogenitor cell. The second one is what we call a committed cell, that once it matures, then it turns into an osteoblast. And that's going to move on to building bone. Okay, so speaking of osteoblasts, okay, this is so important, this next part here, because you're going to hear me talking about this, and I need you to know what this part is. All right, osteoblasts, when they build bone, they make this. It's called osteoid. Okay, so they'll make it and they'll secrete it. So osteoid, all right, is, and this is very important, it's the organic component of bone. Okay, it's the organic component of bone. Because remember, bone is hard, right, for the most part. Okay, but there's two components to bone. There's the organic part and the inorganic part. The organic part is the osteoid. All right, the inorganic part are the bone salts, calcium, phosphate. Okay. So it makes this osteoid, which is a semi-solid organic substance. You'll hear me refer to it as bone matrix. Okay. Then what we do is, and I'm paraphrasing this, then we sprinkle in some bone salts, sprinkle a little calcium with some phosphate, and then that causes the osteoid to harden. The term that we use for hardening is calcify. Okay. When it calcifies, it's like cement drying. Okay, so you got this guy, this osteoblast, that's making the cement, sort of, all right, and they're pouring it all around their body. Okay, and then what happens is they're pouring it around their body, it starts to harden, and then they realize, I can't get out. So they're sealed in. Okay, so they become trapped in that matrix. Just like Montressel from A Cask of Amontillado. Is anyone familiar with that? The famous lines, for the love of God, Montressel. Yes, for the love of God. Edgar Allan Poe, people. Anyways, It's a great story. Yes, it's a great story. It's a story about revenge too, which is kind of scary, much like the Count of Monte Cristo. But anyways, I digress. In the story, the guy is invited to lunch. Real quick story. They dine. One guy that wants to kill him. Well, I've ruined the ending, but anyways, the one guy wants to kill him, so he drugs him. He knocks him out, takes him down into the catacombs under Paris. I believe it's Paris. And then when he wakes up, he's paralyzed. He can't move, and this guy is slowly piling bricks and sealing them into the catacombs there. And so they have this conversation as he's slowly stacking the bricks up. And then there's one brick left, and the guy realizes what's going on. That he's gonna die, and he screams out at the end, "For the love of God, Montrousseau," to let him free. And he says, "Yes, for the love of God." And he stacks the last brick in there. It's a freaky story. It's a good story. But anyways, I compare that to what the osteoblasts do. They pour all this osteoid around them, and then the bone salts come in and they'll harden the matrix, and they get trapped in there. When that happens, they turn into osteocytes. Okay? Because an osteocyte is a mature bone cell, and its job is to maintain the bone matrix. Pretty chill. Just stays there in its lacuna, and it maintains the bone marrow, the bone matrix. Okay? So what is an osteocyte? It's a mature cell. It comes from osteoblasts, all right? And its job is to make sure that if the bone matrix gets damaged or stressed, all right, if it gets damaged, it repairs it. If it gets stressed, perfect example, if you go on a binge, all right, and you start to gain weight and work out and do all sorts of stuff, and say you gain 50 pounds in 3 months, your bones need to compensate for that. Okay, so they'll lay down more bone matrix to make sure that the bones don't crumble under the weight. All right, same thing if you exercise. If you do strenuous exercise, running any type of weight-bearing exercise, your bones respond to that. And so they'll lay down more bone matrix to make the bones stronger. That's what the osteocytes do. That's their job. Okay, so they detect any of the stresses on the bone, and if there's increased stresses, then it's going to grow new bone. Cool. Okay? All right, we're missing one more cell, and that's the osteoclast. These cells are cool. One, because they're a multinucleated cell. They operate through phagocytosis. So they essentially go around and they just chew on the bone. That's their job. They run around, okay? They chew on the bone, and they're the cell that helps to remodel the bone. Or, hey, if we need some calcium real fast, no problem. We stimulate some osteoclasts. Hey, we need calcium, we need some phosphate. So they'll go around and they'll start to digest the bone. And it breaks down the bone matrix, and it releases calcium and phosphate. So you can use it for whatever. Okay? So it looks kind of like this. And I watched a pretty cool documentary on video games this past week. I was watching one on Space Invaders. And an osteoclast looks like that. It's got a bunch of nuclei in here. Okay, so it's got this ruffled border here. And this ruffled border has all these digestive enzymes. Okay, all these digestive enzymes here. And then when it comes in contact with bone, those digestive enzymes go to work on breaking down the bone. Okay, pretty cool. And so what they'll make is they'll start to create these pits or depressions in the bone. All right, we give that a name, resorption lacuna. So your bones are constantly remodeling themselves, depending on what you do, depending on what's happening to you. If you go into zero gravity, for example, you're not weight bearing anymore. So your bone matrix will become less because you're not having that stress of your weight. That's what happens to astronauts in space. We'll talk about that later on in the chapter. Okay? So keep in mind, your osteoclasts, all right, they come from, all right, fused bone marrow cells. That's why they're multinucleated. Okay? Good so far. Not too bad, right? Not too bad. All right. So here we can see a picture of what happens to an osteoprogenitor cell. Here are your osteoprogenitor cells. Okay, they divide. All right, one stays an osteoprogenitor cell, another one becomes an osteoblast. Okay, then that osteoblast starts to secrete its own bone matrix, eventually seals itself off, and then it transitions into an osteocyte, where it hangs out, maintains the bone. And then here you can see we've got our osteoclast. Okay, so we have all these bone marrow cells, they fuse together and turn into the osteoclast. And you can see how it's just kind of phagocytizing and digesting and gnawing away at the bone. Here and here. All right, here we go. Let's get into the bone matrix and its components. All right, I mentioned this earlier, that your bone matrix, all right, has two components, the organic and the inorganic. Okay, the organic is the one that's going to be a little, when I say a little bit more exciting, we're going to spend a little bit more time on it. Inorganic is easy. Okay, so when we're talking about the organic component of our bone matrix, you've got the osteoblast secreting the osteoid. This is hugely important. All right, a significant amount of the osteoid is collagen. Okay, collagen. Another part of the osteoid is the ground substance. So it's pretty much going to be proteoglycans and glycoproteins. That goes back to when we were talking about in the tissue chapter, all right, what ground substance is. Mainly ground substance is water and big molecules. And those big molecules are proteoglycans and glycoproteins. Okay? But this is the one that you really want to be aware of, all right? A significant amount of the osteoid is going to be collagen. All right, this all falls under connective tissue because remember, connective tissue involves cells and then the extracellular matrix. Well, guess what? This osteoid is that extracellular matrix. All right, it involves protein fibers, which is collagen, and then our ground substance. Okay, now we're just kind of clarifying, all right, what we're looking at when we're talking about connective tissue here. Okay, so keep in mind, osteoblasts, I'll repeat myself, synthesize and secrete the osteoid. What exactly is osteoid? Predominantly it's collagen protein fibers, but also a ground substance, which is going to be our proteoglycans and our glycoproteins, and some water, but mainly the proteoglycans and glycoproteins. So, this is very important that you know this. It's the organic component that gives the bone its tensile strength. All right? And what tensile strength is, it's its ability to resist it being stretched. If you bend it a little bit here and there, yank on it. But this is what gives bone its flexibility. Okay? There's not a lot of flexibility in bone. Believe it or not, your bones are somewhat flexible. Okay? They have to be. Because if they didn't have a little bit of tensile strength and able to resist that stretching, all right, force that's placed on, they'd snap like a dried piece of wood. Okay? So it's the organic components that give it that flexibility. So, by that rationale, if we were to somehow be able to take out the osteoid from your bone, right now, if I were to suck it out, what would that do to your bone's flexibility? Well, if we're taking would it be flexible at all? No. In fact, it'd be brittle. They'd be easy to break. All right, and there's a condition, all right, that for you can get a collagen synthesizing condition. We'll talk about that. All right, that will affect your bone, and so it causes the bone to be unable to produce collagen. So one of the symptoms are what we call brittle bones. Okay. All right, the inorganic component. Easy. Salt. All right. Now you see a couple different molecular formulas up here and a couple different names. All right. Like calcium phosphate, calcium hydroxide. But this is the one I really want you to know. Hydroxyapatite. Okay. This is the stuff that's found in your bones. Okay. So we're talking about the inorganic components there. All right, we've got the calcium phosphate and the calcium hydroxide. And both of those components, all right, they'll interact with one another and they form the hydroxyapatite. Now let's look here at the molecular formula for hydroxyapatite. A lot of calcium, all right, ooh, phosphate, okay? So if you look here, okay, there's tons. This is where we get, all right, our calcium for whatever we need it for nervous system stimulation, for muscle contraction, for blood clotting, if we need to, if it's in short supply in our blood. And look at the phosphate. So our osteoclast will go to town on this hydroxyapatite and digest it and then free up, all right, these molecules. And so we can use them for whatever we need, okay? A couple other things that are also found in our bones, all right, obviously calcium carbonate, sodium, yummy, you need sodium, okay? We'll need that for when we're going to actually have nervous system function going on, all right? Fluoride for when we need to brush our teeth. I'm just kidding. All right. But also, just keep in mind, we have several other types of elements that are also going to be found here, all right, in our bone salts, in our bone crystals. Okay. So, where do we find this stuff? We have our collagen fibers laid down, and then we just sprinkle, all right, all these bone crystals, this hydroxyapatite around the collagen fibers, and it'll just kind of cling on to the collagen fibers. So here's a collagen fiber, and then these little circles here, all right, those are going to be, all right, our crystals that they just cling on to that. Okay? And then this process causes the hardening, all right, what we call calcification, all right, and that when the bone crystals come in contact with the collagen fibers, that's what's going to harden the matrix. And that's what gives us the rigidity in our bones. Makes our bones hard. Okay? All right. How are we doing so far? We doing okay? All right. Trying to set you up for a story because we're going to learn how bone is made. This is the beginning portion here. All right. I think we'll get close to where I want to be today. We're doing good. We're doing well. All right. So let's talk about how we make bones. How is bone created? Okay. So it's going to start off, all right, much like when you're making brownies, you got to pour the brownie mix into the pan. All right. It's a goo. Okay, so we're going to start off with the goo. In this case, we're going to start off with osteoid. Okay, so we begin with the osteoid being secreted, well, synthesized and secreted by the osteoblasts. Okay, and then we deposit those hydroxyapatite crystals, all right, into that osteoid, and we harden things. And that process, I told you before, is calcification. Okay. So there's a couple things that we need for this to occur. You can't bake brownies without an oven, okay? So we need a couple things much like that, all right? We need vitamin D. Familiar with vitamin D, right? Okay? Vitamin D, all right, is synthesized by your skin in active form, all right? And then it goes to your liver and it gets converted to calcidiol, then it goes to your kidney and it gets converted to calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. And what vitamin D does is that it absorbs calcium from your GI tract, but specifically from your intestines of your GI tract. Okay, the ileum, the last part of your small intestines. So it's going to absorb the calcium. Okay, all right, at an increased rate from your small intestine. Okay. Now we didn't talk too much about vitamin C. I briefly mentioned vitamin C to you, but we talked about scurvy in lab. Okay. In order for collagen to be made appropriately, okay, for it to be made appropriately, you need vitamin C. Because when collagen is being made, it's these long strands, and at the end of the strands, they're kind of like these little tethers here. Okay. And what vitamin C does is it comes along and it chops those off. And then what's remaining is the good stuff. So we need it for collagen formation, okay? And then obviously, okay, we need both calcium and phosphate to make the hydroxyapatite for our calcification. So we need vitamin D, vitamin C, calcium, and phosphate to occur. Bones to be made, okay? Those are our ingredients. Okay, so now we made bone. But as we grow and as we gain and lose weight, we sometimes have to alter our bone. Okay, we might have to make it thicker. We might have to make it thinner. Okay, so in order to do that, to remodel the bone, okay, we sometimes have to destroy the bone matrix. And so this is where we bring in the heavy lifters, the osteoclasts. Okay, so they come in with the ruffled border there, right, that has those enzymes. Okay. And those enzymes come from, you guessed it, our lysosomes. Osteoclasts are loaded with lysosomes, and lysosomes have those digestive enzymes. Okay? And so their job is to go in there and they destroy the organic matrix. Because remember, we need the organic matrix, all right, for the hydroxyapatite crystals to cling on to. So if we don't have the organic matrix there, then those hydroxyapatite crystals just float away. Okay? And that's okay because we need that to float away because we might need it for something. But while we're remodeling the bone, all right, the hydroxyapatite crystals just go off, all right? Not to worry because we have a little bit of hydrochloric acid from our digestive enzymes there that breaks down those hydroxyapatite crystals into calcium and phosphate. And that calcium and phosphate can now enter into our bloodstream and travel around our blood. Maybe go to another bone to be used for its bone matrix. Maybe it's going to go to the heart to be used for the contraction of the heart muscle, okay? But it's going to go into our bloodstream. If we're hypo, all right, calcemic, that means you have low blood calcium, then this process is going to be very helpful in helping to increase your blood calcium levels, okay? So low blood calcium levels is known as hypo, I'll type it out. Hypocalcemia. And then obviously if you have too much calcium in your blood, it's hypercalcemia. Not to be confused with hypokalemia. Hypokalemia is low blood potassium levels. And that's bad, because that'll mess your heart up fast. Okay. So, now we're going to kind of talk about, in a little bit more detail, all right, the functional units, all right, of our bones, specifically the compact bone. So you guys remember the osteons, right? That's our tree-like structure, okay? You got the central canal in the center here, and then you got these almost like tree ring structures around it, okay? That's what we refer to as an osteon. It's a cylindrical structure. Another name for it is the Haversian system, okay? But keep in mind, it is a functional and structural unit of mature compact bone, okay? So, it's described here, I like to describe it as tree rings. You can describe it as a bullseye target, whatever, okay? But you have to understand that these osteons are parallel to the diaphysis, okay? Parallel to the diaphysis. All right, and I'll show you a picture here. So if you don't worry at all. Let's go through the components of it, and then I'll show you a quick picture. All right, you guys remember the central canal, right? That's that dark circle at the center of our osteon. All right, that's where we have our blood vessels and our nerve. All right, that actually will travel through there. And then you got the rings that go around the central canal. All right, those are called concentric lamellae. All right, these are the ones, all right, that are rings that completely encircle the central canal. And in it, you'll find that's where the collagen fibers are found. Now, this is the really cool part about it. These collagen fibers, all right, are going to be at 90 degrees from one another. So what does that mean? Okay, I'll find the picture. Then we'll just, there we go. All right, so here you can see, here's an osteon, okay? You all agree? Osteon, central canal, blood vessels, nerve, okay? And then each ring is like a layer on a wedding cake kind of thing, okay? So this picture is showing you, we have our osteon, now we're just gonna pull up each of the rings. So we're pulling up each ring, and then we're pulling up the ring that's inside of it, and if there was another one inside it, we'd pull that one up, okay? So what these lines here that you're seeing, these are, all right, these are the collagen fibers. And so the collagen fibers on this, all right, ring are actually at 90 degrees to this ring. It's really kind of a cool phenomenon because it's that 90-degree orientation, all right, from lamellae to lamellae that helps to give bone its structural integrity. Now, I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer, all right? You know, they would know more how that works, but I just memorized the fact that that 90-degree orientation helps to provide that rigidity and the strength of bone, compact bone, okay? So that's what we're seeing here. There we go, okay? So keep that in mind. It's those, the fact that they're at 90 degrees from one another that helps to give bone its strength and its resiliency to external stresses, okay? So the predominant bone cell type is going to be the osteocyte, okay? And they live in the lacunae there, okay? And their job is to maintain that bone matrix. Their job is to maintain collagen fibers there so the hydroxyapatite crystals can deposit themselves along it, okay? Now, you have a lacuna here, and you have a lacuna here, okay? And you'll see these little black lines that go from one lacuna to another, all right? And they just travel out, okay? Those are what we call cannuliculi, and they're these small little channels that will connect one lacuna to another lacuna. And it's really kind of cool because it allows the osteocytes in each of those lacunas to make contact with a neighboring osteocyte. So what they can do is they can communicate to one another. They can share nutrients with one another. So it's really fascinating. So when we're trying to stimulate osteocytes to do something from a sensory neuron, okay, one osteocyte can get some information, and then it'll transmit that information to maybe 2 other osteocytes, and those 2 other osteocytes can communicate it to 5 other osteocytes, all right? But this is what allows these cells to communicate with one another through that intercellular contact there. So you can see, all right, they can trade off nutrients, minerals, gases, all sorts of stuff, all right? It's really kind of a neat situation that they have, but it allows them to communicate with one another and allow them to get the word out, so to speak. All right. Now, I think this might be the last slide. Yes, this will be the last slide for today. All right. So, a couple structures that you do need to know that are not part of an osteon, okay? They are not part, are the perforating or Volkmann canals, okay? These canals are perpendicular to the central canal. So you'll have a central canal going up and down, all right, running parallel to the diaphysis. Well, the Volkmann canals go this way, okay? So they'll be found perpendicular to the central canal. So this is a CC, central canal. And then this is a VC, Volkmann or perforating canal, right there, okay? So these perforating canals can allow communication between different, all right, central canals. That's what we're seeing here. So here's your central canal, and then you got your perforating or Volkmann canals. So now we're going parallel to the diaphysis, but now this is perpendicular. So you can see you've got all these blood vessels and nerves just traveling all around, and these are these little like gopher tunnels. Anyone ever heard of the game called Dig Dug? It's a game from the 1980s. Well, anyways, you dig underground, and that's your job. And these monsters are trying to kill you, and so it looks like a Dig Dug map. But wait. All right. Last two parts of this, the circumferential lamellae and the interstitial lamellae. Circumferential lamellae, like the circumference of something, all right, is going to cover the entirety of that something. So the external circumferential lamellae, they're going to be, all right, the part that runs on the outside of the compact bone, but internal to the periosteum. I'll come right back to this. I'll just show you real fast. That's this right here. These lamellae, see how it goes almost all the way around the entire bone? Okay, that's the external circumferential lamellae. Okay, the internal circumferential lamellae are going to be the lamellae that are going to be internal to the endosteum. So they're going to be just internal or interior to the spongy bone there. Okay, but one of the things you have to understand is that both of these are going to go the entire circumference of the bone. Okay, so that's like, here's my bone, here's the medullary cavity on the inside, all right? So the circumferential lamellae are out here, and they go all the way around, and, all right? And then the internal circumferential lamellae are on the inside here, okay? And then finally, we got the interstitial lamellae. These are partially, I don't want to say existing, but remaining lamellae that came from old osteons. All right, that were partially absorbed. Okay, during the remodeling process, all right, the osteoclast didn't completely destroy the whole osteon. They may have just digested part of it. So, quick picture here. This is what you're seeing. Here, okay, here's a full osteon. Here's another full osteon, but in between, you can see parts of some old lamellae. Okay, in between. Okay, and that's the interstitial lamellae. They just weren't completely resorbed during that resorption process there. Dig Dug. See, I was born at the perfect time because that's when arcades were coming around. The 80s were in full swing. I mean, it was good times. Okay, so that'll be it for today for lecture. Here's another picture here just to show you. All right, you can see the collagen fibers here are osteon. All right, you got the lacuna here and the little cannuliculi coming out from the lacuna. Okay, this is an even better picture. All right, perfect. So that will end. All right, we'll end on this. We'll pick this up on what's today? Thursday, Tuesday. All right, let's take a break, everybody. Let's stop recording.